Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today for the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies Roundtable on Premodern Critical Race Studies New Directions. My name is Brandy Adams, and I'm coming to you from ACMRS headquarters in the warm and sunny Tempe of Arizona State University in the traditional Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community homelands, as well as the Odom known as the Pima, the Pipash known as the Maricopa, and their ancestors. Today, we will be hearing 5-minute presentations from Herman Bennett, Surekha Davies, Cécile Fromont, Pablo Gómez, and Hannah Murphy. I refer you to the website for their many accolades and accomplishments. If you plan to tweet about this event, we ask that you use the hashtag ACMRS events. Now, without further ado, we shall start with the roundtable with Herman.
In 1648, in his last philosophical work, The Passions of the Soul, the early modern mathematician and philosopher René Descartes wrote, quote, "When our first encounter with some object surprises us and we find it novel or very different from what we formerly knew or from what we supposed it ought to be, this causes us to wonder and to be astonished at it. Since all this may happen before we know whether or not the object is beneficial to us, I regard wonder as the first of all passions," end quote. Unlike the Castilian encounter and Spain's subsequent uneven dialogue with the Amerindians, neither the Portuguese nor the Spaniards' discovery of Guinea elicited wonder. In the Americas, wonder fostered Spanish inquiries into the Indies, into the Indians' nature, which resulted in the Spanish monarchy ascribing distinct corporate status to los indios. Iberians did not, however, entertain Africans as the other. Alterity in the modern, quote, alterity in the modern philosophical sense, writes the literary theorist Rolena Adorno, was an impossibility in the theological world of the 16th century, and specifically Spain. Indeed, in the last decades of the 15th century, it was through the absence of wonder that the Moorish infidel was distinguished from the pagan blackamoor, whom the Iberians deemed legitimate slaves. The blackamoor did not inspire surprise. After all, and this absence enabled the Iberians, in the words of Descartes, to consider him without passion. At this stage of Portugal's expansion, that is the late 15th century, Europe's cultural arsenal precluded the absolute differences among humans. The Portuguese consequently incorporated the blackamoors and blacks whom they enslaved into the Christian Republica as both bond persons and as individuals with souls. Through this theological universalism, Iberians engendered openings for a novel juridical status, individualism, that ethnic Africans steadily availed themselves of both in Europe and eventually in the Americas. Here, let me just note that the interconnectedness between the absence of wonder and the emergent Black individuals had serious implications for the meanings of the African diaspora and how experience among peoples of African descent, now located in the colonial archives, can be inscribed as history. Although the state of the body, that is how it was utilized, concerned Christians, the real concern rested with the soul. The soul made a human being and reasonable beings. It shaped the passions, including, among others, love, hate, hope, and fear, which, according to the Portuguese chronicler Zorara, all of us naturally have. A century after the Portuguese saw Blacks as being composed of the same elements, a new discourse of difference had emerged. By that time, this new discourse emerged ascendant. The Iberians had already settled the subject status of those Africans who were a part of the diaspora. Since the theological universalism of Iberians positioned Black diasporic subjects as individuals, they did not treat them in accordance with the laws of nations as they did sovereign subjects. In contrast to their treatment of the Indians of the Americas, the Iberians did not, however, view Africans as childlike wards. Instead, they incorporated Africans into the Christian Republica as pagans and as willful recalcitrants who consciously disavowed Christianity. Meanwhile, those Africans spared enslavement could potentially become slaves if they lost their sovereign status. Though the Iberians justified the enslavement of Africans on the grounds of their corporateless status and as those who willfully disdained Christianity, they also placed significant weight on the diasporic subject status as the products of just war, even one in which Africans were the sole actors. The ecclesiastical authorities sanctioned their dominion over enslaved African bodies on the basis that it contained a recalcitrant soul in need of Christian exposure and had to be held to the highest of Christian standards. Thus, the juridical presence of Africans in the Iberian world manifested itself in the ecclesiastical realm, which has engendered a still under-theorized and largely untheorized archival excess. To mine and contextualize this excess calls for a different conceptual approach than we are accustomed to when our starting point and inspiration is the brilliance of the Anglophone critique of the archive of slavery. Spaniards, but also the Portuguese, largely produced and housed proceedings involving Africans in the ecclesiastical realm. The cultural logic of this practice, of this political practice, takes issue with those scholars who strictly examine the workings of the secular domain and bemoan the paucity of sources. Today, in fact, their fragmented narratives of the African and Black past can be found in ecclesiastical records that comprise part of the Spanish and Portuguese imperial archives. Any effort to recover and inscribe the African presence in the early modern Spanish Atlantic must grapple with the ways in which Christian colonialism, like European conquest, manifested its dominion over and through territory. In the case of sovereignless Africans, Christian colonialism constituted itself in and around the Black diasporic subject's body as the territory which housed their souls. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. We will now hear from Surekha.
Thank you so much. '16th century writers and thinkers in Europe inherited a framework for understanding human difference that was environmental, social, and malleable, not fixed or exclusively biological. Ancient writers like Galen, Hippocrates, and Pliny the Elder had asserted that human bodies, behaviors, and temperaments were affected by climate and environment. Very harsh environments, such as those of the far north and the equator, were deemed to cause minds and bodies to degenerate, and even to engender monstrous people, ontologically different from regular folks. Readers of travel and geographical literature drew connections between a region's location, climate, environment, foodstuffs, and the physical, mental, and moral states of its inhabitants. These ideas also raised problems of ontology. If people moved from one region to another, their physical and mental characteristics would eventually change. Around 1500, European tools for explaining human variety around the known world began to break down. Atlantic exploration posed the problem of how to reconcile information garnered from long-distance voyages with ideas about the distant East and South that had long circulated in classical, biblical, and medieval sources. Where then was the boundary between regular people and monstrous peoples, or between human space and monster space? This question had ramifications for the colonial project. Newly found peoples in the West might turn out to lack the mental capacities for becoming Christian. Even worse, European Christians or their offspring might degenerate if they spent too long in the wrong environment. In the 15th century, mapmakers in Western Europe began to project world maps using the grid system of latitude and longitude devised by Ptolemy, the 2nd century CE Greco-Egyptian geographer. This world map lists latitudes and climatic zones along the left-hand border. Maps like this made relationships between space, race, and time explicit and visual. Viewers could compare the physical appearance, behaviors, and locations of the world's peoples. Since the quality of a people's minds could not be apprehended directly from the senses, You observe bodies and behaviors to extrapolate how climate might have changed their minds over time. By implication, political and colonial administration had to be attuned to the local inhabitants. As Nicolas F Gómez has observed, geography and politics were intricately intertwined in the machine of the world. Maps were key artifacts in the history of race in its intersections with European colonialism and empire. Well, here are a few images of peoples of the Americas from early modern maps. Map text and images made two kinds of claims. One was epistemological, how to make new knowledge about distant people. The second was ontological, what did it mean to be human, and where were the boundaries between humans and monsters? Monsters were thought experiments about category breakers. Inventing them brought supposedly normative, supposedly real categories into being. Settler colonial projects raised new anxieties about the fixity of the body or its lack thereof. Thus, there was an existential imperative for emphasizing the physical dimensions in racial hierarchy, even before there was an economic motive. Maps were not the only visual comparative genre that constituted human ontology and racial hierarchy. In our conversation today, we might also think about other comparative formats that bring multiple cultures into the space of a single glance: curiosity cabinets, costume books, and casta paintings. In what ways did they facilitate racial thinking and racial logic? To what extent did they make possible lines of argument that hadn't been fully apparent before, just as in the case of early modern maps? Thank you.
Thank you, Surekha. And now we will hear from Cécile.
Thank you so much. So ironically, for an art historian, I did not bring any images because then I'll start talking about them and we won't make it in 5 minutes. But I'm speaking as an art historian and thinking about perspective and invisibility and how these are key here. A core aspect of my practice and a central node in my teaching and training of emerging scholars of the early modern worlds is precisely to learn how to address critically those silences, the blind spots, or the purposeful veilings that have shaped understanding and also analysis of the early modern period, and also of the long shadow that it casts over our own times. These gaps can be the making of actors in the early modern period, or the making of actors in more recent times through interpretations and misinterpretations. So I see two areas and two temporalities that need to be addressed in that kind of research. So the two terrains are the one of the archive and the one of interpretation, and the two temporalities are the early modern period as well as now. I see in these two areas that interventions are needed. So first, to think about the archive, and we are all doing it on this panel. We need to question and recast the shape and the nature of the archive, thinking about sources that hold the possibility of forming archives of their own too. And in doing that, there is no inventory, there is no catalogue raisonné, right? It can be daunting, but it's also an opportunity, really, because you set your own tracks. And as we know, this has yielded really inspiring example in scholarship and writing in general. I'm thinking of Saidiya Houtman, of course. And in art history, also this type of research has emerged particularly in the last couple of decades, since the so-called global turn, but I've belonged more to the non-Euro-American subfields. So that as it may, that type of work poses practical questions, and that's something I want to bring into our conversation. Practical questions for us, practical questions for the emerging scholars that are working on that, with issues of very practical matters of support and outside perceptions. Because simply when you create your own archive, before you can turn to interpretation, your work will follow a path that does not look like that in other subfields. And in a way, although the bar is higher to some extent, all of that work is in many ways not always visible. And I think it is our role, all of us who work in this area, to constantly remind ourselves and others about that work that can become invisible. At the level of interpretation, I was thinking about two issues. So first, understanding how recent interpretations in historiography have thrown different types of veils over the past, right? This is at the core of what we're doing, and with our lessons we have learned very well from Trio, for example, or in art history from Caroline Dean and Dana Lipson's, in particular in their hybridity and their discontent article. And in my experience, the content of this new archives often don't merely enrich or deepen or reframe the current or the former understanding, but they completely evade sometimes or radically challenge these available frameworks of interpretation, sometimes even radical and new frameworks of interpretations. And a question I wanted to bring for us to in our conversation is that of how do we train ourselves and our students to be ready for that, difficult and scary work. And finally, as a last word, I wanted to say that I've been purposefully vague about the what in what is that we research in answering this prompt about the future of critical race studies. And I'm vague on purpose because I speak from a perspective where, as a researcher and as a teacher, as a mentor, my inquiries on the so far invisible and the so far untheorized in and about the early modern Atlantic worlds contribute to critical race studies. But it is not necessarily a framework that I call upon from the outset. And it is a bit of a political statement to say so. Even though I do not call upon that framework from the outset, researching the topic that I do contribute to the reflection of critical race studies. And that reflection, on the other hand, form a constitutive part of my commitment, right, to think better about the past in order to understand better the present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cécile. And now we will go to Pablo.
All right, can you guys hear me? Excellent. So I want to make use of my short time today to briefly say what I think is at stake when we are discussing ideas about race in the pre-modern period, and to mention some work that I'm doing on this area and ideas that are coming out of one of my current research projects. So for me, the crucial question in the examination of the history of the concept of race in the pre-modern period is how race emerges as a distinct concept related to human difference, and how such concept is specifically related to the emergence of notions of nature in this era. So in many ways, this is to say that when thinking about race as a way of thinking about nature itself, we recognize that race emerges, right, about in ways that allow us to conceptualize the concept or to organize the concept historically, and that the organization of ideas about race help Europeans in their colonial projects, as we know very well, in their very ways of organizing the world, right? In other words, that the emergence of natural philosophy, natural history is closely related as in terms of taxonomy, in terms of epistemology, to race as a category. And in saying this, what I'm also signaling is that I think that in tracing and being careful about the historicity of the concept and its emergence, right, like throughout the early modern era, what we are doing is being careful also in recognizing how it is associated with the emergence of capitalism, the scientific project itself, in ways that associated and detaching it from it. And I'm talking about race, not ideas of race as we understand it to be associated with biomedicine and science in ensuing centuries. It allows us to also put that valence, that the analytical valence of the concept in a very specific moment in time, and I said it with also specific colonial projects that I think we are in danger of pushing aside if we try to trace this concept when ideas, and in here I'm gonna refer to the notions that Herman was bringing up before, ideas about the very nature of or human essence, right, like as related to soul, to religion, that until these 15th, 16th century dominated understandings of what it was the meaning of being human. So there are crucial epistemological, archival, social, and cultural differences between these histories of human difference and race and racism in different spaces, both in Europe and in other spaces throughout these different eras. Also race, and this is thinking about the work of people like Jean-Frédéric Schoab and Lara Fernau that have said that race is a political project. And as such, it is important that the analysis remain not only to the historical evidence, but we recognize that in all of its contradictions, race has remained a naturalized category in the minds of so many because the power it has to draw the instinct of recognizing fundamental, and I'm quoting here this idea of the natural differences in the other. So, but that location of what is natural, what is human, and what is the essence of the human being is at the core of the organization and modern ontologization of human difference. So in other words, these early moderns rejected human nature as soulful and included humans in nature in specific parts in Europe, right? And this is crucially different from the geographic, ethnic, religious differentiations of earlier eras and in other geographical spaces that coincided with the emergence of race within a specific concepts. And more directly related to my current research, I want to signal the appearance of modern, the appearance of modern ideas about the individual, the very own existence of our senses of being in the world, were validated by description on the apparatus of the state by a series of practices that started in the early modern era. And here I'm thinking of course, the work of Cole, Warwick Anderson, and many others. So we exist and are who we are in the categories of the states, at least for the purposes of the number that measure our existence in and through these descriptions. This process of organization of bodies and numbers, categories in bureaucratic spaces, is also one that I think is intrinsically related to the emergence of the slave trade and alongside the emergence of modern conceptualizations of race. So I've been working on a project that works around the identification of quantifiable universal bodies that emerge out of the slave trade, but also the organization of risk financial investment around the world of the Atlantic slave trade. So it is not only in the ledgers that we can see the quantification of bodies, but in the kind of processes that it organizes and that simultaneously allows both for the codification of human bodies and diseases, their accounting, and the production of a set of human beings that can be thought of as essentially outside of the paradoxically emerging notion of individuality and belonging to the state. So the technologies go hand in hand, but the conceptualization of race itself, it is interestingly emerging out of process that do not necessarily argue for those differentiation within the ledgers of the accountants of, in this case, slave traders in the Atlantic world. So race as a political project is essential for the sustainment of a project that is also intended for the universalization of human bodies. So as philosopher Justin Smith says, people are administered into being, brought into existence through record keeping, census taking, and bills of sale. So just to end, I want to say that the history of pre-modern race matters profoundly, and the ways in which these technologies of the organization of bodies appear in the Atlantic world also matter profoundly, both for the organization of modern individuality, the state, and race. Race is essential for the imagination of science. Race is essential for the taxonomization of the world. Race is essential basically for organization of our own systems of understanding human nature, the nature of the state, and the nature of our societies. And as such, it's a profoundly political project, and it is because of this that it persists in ways that it will be seemingly impossible to think with all the work that we have done to kind of dissociate these things and disembody themselves, the concept of race itself, but it's still with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. And last but not least, we will hear from Hannah.
Thanks so much, Brandy. And thank you to Ayana and Talia as well for organizing this panel. I am beyond humbled by my inclusion on it. I'm not an expert in pre-modern critical race studies, though as you'll see, I've been inspired by the scholarship and the challenge it's offered historians such as myself to rethink core disciplinary assumptions in the light of its arguments. I've also been very directly influenced by the work of all of the historians at this virtual table, and I'm honored to share in their conversation. So rather than addressing the question of race directly, I want to talk a little bit about a group of people and a categorization through which ideas of race emerged. So I'm going to talk very briefly about my new project, Medicine in the Making of Race, 1440 to 1720, the aim of which is very simply to examine practical involvement by medical practitioners in the early years of the slave trade. And I'm going to share my screen. You can tell that I am, yeah. Okay, so this work draws on three important bodies of scholarship: pre-modern critical race studies, a generation of which has shown us not only that Europeans were well versed in the intricacies and violence of slavery, but that racialization was an inextricable component of early modern culture, co-produced alongside concepts of gender, patriarchy, and rule. This is probably not an audience I need to tell this to, but the history of slavery in African diasporas, which has challenged us, as Herman has just challenged us again, to think more deeply about pre-colonial entanglements between Europe and African kingdoms and territories, as well as to recognize their constituent role in the making of European modernity. And the historiography of science and medicine, in which I'm most, as a historian of science and medicine, I'm most firmly rooted. So in putting these together, it focuses on sources generated by medical practitioners. And this is an umbrella term for what was in fact a group, largely male, of wildly different levels of expertise, social standing, social authority, and geographic and cultural backgrounds. And it's my contention that these differences, which are key to the professionalization of medicine, are also crucial for understanding sometimes conflicting trajectories that medical knowledge and medical practice played in European projects of race making. So from the very first moments of European enslaving encounters, in fact, in the chronicle that Herman mentioned earlier by Azurara, medical practitioners played a key role. In practical terms, they staffed ships and treated passengers. They advised on purchases and they brokered exchanges, making sense of commodities and mediating between concepts of local and foreign bodies and diseases. By the 17th century, expertise in the treatment of slaves, and I use the term as they did, was a valuable professional commodity. You can see here these travel narratives written by physicians who contributed to the kind of ethnography that Surekha is talking about and the kind of ethnography that many scholars of pre-modern critical race studies have brought to our attention. These travel narratives in turn played back into a growing professional status on shore. So I suggest that not only did slavery depend on European medicine, but the development of European medicine was tied inextricably to its experiences in the arena of the slave trade. Medical roles in the slave trade were eventually codified, and these sources are key to the work that Pablo has been talking about. I'm sure he has many, many, many more of them. So this kind of source is a prime example, and we've done work on this in a project that I'm a member of, the Renaissance Skin Project, And these are contaduría, records that are kept across the port cities of the Spanish Empire, which contain within them details of individual interactions between medical practitioners and enslaved peoples. And to speak just a little bit about the kind of archival riches that Herman has alluded to, there are hundreds of thousands of these individuals captured within these records in these archives. A source like this tells us a part of the enslaved person's story. In fact, there's a detailed physical description of 21 people just on this page. It translates that story through medicine. It fixes a diagnosis onto these individuals, which ties directly into their valuation. So medicine here is the mediating knowledge through which an individual is transformed into a commodity. And it shows us that medical and knowledge and expertise was necessary to the structures of the slave trade. So I think this is what I mean when I say that the slave trade was medicalized. It proves without a shadow of a doubt the role of medicine in establishing bureaucracy and systems. And this is, I think, what Pablo is taking maybe a step further in thinking about quantification. The question remains then, how does this hands-on practice relate to sources by sort of self-professedly learned men, anatomy, microscopy, emergent notions of epidemiology and disease, and climatology, which contributed to the late 17th century trend in racialization in medicine, which has been sketched by many historians of science and medicine. What I'm interested in and what I think can tie these things together is the dynamic of the body in this, because this kind of knowledge is just as embodied and related to practice as it is to learning and profession. Bodies are at the heart of these large-scale projects of anatomy and dissection and microscopy, and tracing these bodies back to their origins is possible sometimes through the paratexts and correspondence of the physicians involved. But the final thing to note is that there's a dynamic that takes place here where this kind of knowledge effectively overpowers the knowledge of artisans, surgeons, and barber surgeons who are our informants about the practice of medicine within the slave trade itself. And this dynamic contributes to exactly to this kind of veiling that I think in part Cécile is talking about here. We have to think about recapturing knowledge and racial modes of making race within these currencies of knowledge, which has been submerged by the emergence of different forms of racialization. Crucially, each encounter brings with it the possibility of thinking differently about the enslaved person and their body. And so my hope is that by thinking about this problem through the lens of medicine and science, I can uncover materials that are of use to broader communities of scholars. Contaduría, travel narratives, inventories of museums and collections, scientific treatises and accounts of disease. All of these are also part and parcel of what Kim Hall has told us are the languages of Blackness. And in many cases, they reveal the embodied intimate practices of individual people over which this language is written. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you, so much for your capacious comments and exciting commentary about the directions in which this scholarship can go. I think right now we'll just open the floor to our speakers so that they can converse with one another, and to the audience out there, we encourage you to use the question and answer box, and we will be taking questions towards the end of our discussion here. I suppose I could get the ball rolling by referring once again to Sadia Hartman and asking a question that she asks about the archive and how can these narratives embody life in words and at the same time respect what we cannot know. And the work that you're all doing is uncovering so much of what we collectively do not know, but there are still going to be gaps, relative gaps in the archive, no matter what archival sources we look for. So I thought perhaps that might be a way to start.
I just want to take the prerogative just to go because I was quick on my hands. And I just want to say that I want to turn that question on its head. You know, as somebody who I'm sitting here and I'm looking at scenes of subjection, and I'm just and I'm, you know, as a lot of you know, just deeply engaged with the work of Saidiya and others. And I guess what I want to think about is that work is so brilliant, but it also, at a certain point, the work itself, it speaks to a specific kind of episteme that in some ways does limit us from actually doing the kind of critical work that, you know, that I'm thinking that I know that's represented by many of you on in this panel. And you know, I'm just thinking about, like, you know, like for instance, Pablo's Experimental Caribbean, you know, and I'm just thinking about that opening scene, you know, that is just mind-boggling, and it continues to be a mind-boggling. And if we actually route that through a kind of liberal secular archive, that in a way that is sort of framed by the Anglo-American framing of slavery, that sort of positions after, you know, afterlife of slavery, all of those frameworks, what it does is that it already colors our understandings. And I think that's sort of what Cécile was talking about, and you guys understand. I think it colors our understanding of how we come to an archive of abundance and excess, right? And so it's not that, you know, someone like Pablo is just like, you know, well, I just found this great document that I'm going to deal with it unmediated. He literally is taking this and does an incredible amount of work to sort of destabilize the history of medicine, right? And his subjects actually utter things, right? They're theorists as well as medical practitioners and others, right? And I want to think about that as a way of us having an entree into that without necessarily becoming some kind of Protestant Catholic divide that reproduces the thing that traps, you know, those of us who work in Christian archives, ecclesiastical archives, or Catholic spaces. That's all I just want to say. I think that there's a prism there that also becomes a prison house.
Yeah, if I can jump on this. It's been, you know, something I've been thinking about again as the kind of historian who works from the object out, right, and from the sources to the stories that they allow us to tell. It's, you know, I've taken Hartman's push to make sure that we go to the limit of the possibilities that we come from the sources. But at the same time, I think, you know, when you work with visual and material culture, but I think also when you work in a different way with the archival written sources, that you can certainly take the direction that is, you know, going the other way, as Herman was saying, that, you know, you can let yourself be driven by the archive instead of, you know, looking for the failings possibly of the archives, because then, you know, we're putting perhaps words into the worlds that we're trying to describe, right? And the world making shouldn't necessarily be ours as historians.
Pablo?
Thank you. I just wanted to very quickly follow up both on your question, Brandy, and on the comments by Herman and Cécile. I think that, and especially talking about our discussion today, I think that in thinking with these sort of different epistemology for thinking about human difference that emerges and that is visible. This is the crucial thing. Herman is saying, and Cécile is also saying, it is visible in these archives in ways, right, like that it is not in other spaces, right, and that follow different trajectories. So there is an issue at the level of the archive, but there is an issue also at the level of the epistemology that we use to analyze these archives. When we think about race in the ways in which I was just signaling, right, like as associated with a specific Northern and Central European project, associated with science and capitalism and colonialism from a specific way, right? Like what we're saying is that there are specific ways in which that transcends to our work, right? Like, but I think if I heard you, Herman, correctly, and I totally agree with you, we're missing this vast world, right? Like in which human difference and the violences of human difference and the possibilities of intersectionalities that of different sorts that are happening in spaces like the Portuguese colonies, like the Spanish colonies, like the Caribbean. We are missing that, and we, I think, and you're absolutely right, we lack a real theorization of how that human difference is also functioning, right, like in specific ways for the understanding of these projects. Because in using race, right, like we are borrowing something that doesn't fit correctly, not only with the archival materials that we have with the different, but also with the trajectories, intellectual trajectories of these spaces that, as you all know, through the history of the Black legend, have also been kind of pushed away from the development of the specific, quote unquote, enlightened intellectual scientific space in Europe. So both things go hand in hand, both the epistemological aspects of how we think about racial human difference, the different complexity that it has, but also the archives, the ways in which we approach those archives, the categories that we use to think with those archives. So.
Surekha?
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the places where the missing things go is into genres where we don't expect them to go. So when you say the word map, you think of something kind of visual, and unless you're a medieval literature scholar, you're not thinking, aha, chivalric romances. But the work of someone like Nahir Otaño Gracia, tells us that actually geography and race and identity are confected together. So it's kind of one of the ways one can build an archive is to think orthogonally and laterally, and also to take each like micro genre on its own terms, think, well, what gets confected out of the conventions right here? What are the horizons of possibility? And of course, people have worked on things like, Casta paintings and shown, new arguments come out of each type of archival object.
Can I just add, I mean, I love that way of thinking about it. I think that the limits of the archive are something that historians we're all to in one way or another, historians, there's something that historians have grappled with since the end of the 19th century. But in disciplinary terms, as a historian, I'll always say that I love the archive. It's not the archive's fault how it was sorted and how it was ordered and which documents were kept. It's often a problem of classification, of looking past, finding aids and past categorizations and past kind of ways of ordering things. And you can do that, as Surekha says, by thinking in imaginative and orthogonal ways. You can do it by doing by blending your methodologies, by looking at different kinds of sources, by starting with the object out. But there is, at heart and in principle, there's just a lot in them that we also haven't looked at. And while I take the critique of the fetishization of the archive really seriously, I think that it behooves us, to actually think about what's there as well as to think about what's absent, and to turn our attention, to answer this challenge that has been put to us, to read the archives again and to see what's there in a new way, asking this new question.
Yeah, I would sort of say that part of, and I think that we do need to go back to the archives, but I also think that and I've been sort of trying to make this case, we also need to be doing other things about going back to libraries in a certain way. And I don't mean that just in the context of COVID. I'm saying that in terms of much of the work that we're trying to do around race and slavery in the context of the Anglo-American Academy, specifically the American Academy, literally has a 20th century history. And so, and much of the stuff that many of us had to read and think about and were socialized intellectually in all sorts of ways, even the kind of epistemic framing that we came to, was always already about recovery, as opposed to sort of thinking about what it would mean to go back to some of this stuff and to be writing histories that are forward looking, as opposed to trying to say, oh, well, let's go back and think about the Black experience, or let's think about the African experience, or let's think about race and its formation in all of these different ways, right? And so that much of this work has always been a kind of unpeeling, as opposed to sort of thinking about it from a different direction. And I feel like it's not only that we just need to go to the libraries and go back into these archives and just sit, but we also just have to linger, right? We have to linger and think about some of the things, linger as a method, right? I mean, this is one of the sessions here. I mean, there's literally sort of thinking through the ways in which the stuff that we look at, that it might allow us in different kinds of ways to ask different questions at different moments in our own formations, but also the formation of the American University, and also the formation of our relationship to these subjects.
Real quick before I move to Surekha, I also wonder if it's disciplinary conversations that need to take place, because there are scholars who engage in this kind of practice. And I will shout out to Imtiaz Habib, Black Lives in the English Archives, which, yes, it's situated in an Anglo-American discourse, but the sort of imaginative thinking and looking and re-looking at archives for material that other people deemed not as interesting, I think is extremely important. And I think that historians and literary critics need to talk a little bit more, because I think sometimes disciplinary lines keep us from these important conversations. Surekha?
Thank you. Just briefly, writing fiction, little bits, little prompts, you don't have to show it to anyone. You don't have to cry because it doesn't look like Hartman, but it makes you think differently about the gaps.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to take a look at some of the questions. We have some really fantastic questions from the audience. We'll start off with Christine Johnson. One of the many payoffs of critical race studies is in establishing the power and work of whiteness. And I wonder if any of the panelists want to comment on how their work might contribute to part of this particular project: whiteness and monstrosity, whiteness and the meritocracy of the archive, certain types of expected archival canonical work.
I can take quickly that. I will be brief. I know we have only 10 minutes, but as I was explaining, right, like part of what I'm interested in here, right, like it is in disentangling what seems to be and put it into evidence what seems to be separate histories, right? Like the emergence of ideas about citizenship, individuality that we know, right, like are closely associated with the emergence of the enslaved African, right, like as dehumanized as somebody without that Western individuality, right? Like we know that, but at the same time, the emergence of conceptualizations of bodies that can be numbered, that can be thought of as being able to belong into the apparatus of the state, right? Like, and that has an idea, right? Like, because that is what is implied also in the organization of certain kinds of, when you create normativity for bodies, and in this we are creating the normativity that gave us, right? Like both whiteness and maleness, right? As specifically at the center of how we think about those, the flesh itself. The flesh, the kind of diseases that we think of as being relevant, and that goes hand in hand, and is preceded by the technologies again that give us, right, like that dehumanization and the organization of human property, right? Like, so we're talking about the different kind of layers, right, that are so intermeshed, I believe, right, like in the thinking of our legal system, our biomedical systems, scientific systems, histories of natural history and philosophy, that sometimes they seem to be completely separated. It seems to be contradictory that we're thinking about universal bodies, universal diseases, at the same time that we're thinking about Blackness. But Blackness, as such, only emerges because, as Christine is pointing out here, it emerges alongside that state that is white, that state that has white as an idea, bodies that are the bodies that will create the nation states, the nation states that are white too. If you have to remember that too. So both legal, political regimes associated with scientific medical regimes associated with slavery. So just to point out something that directly answers, or at least touches upon what I think is a very important question there.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you. We'll move on. There's a question for Hannah. Could you comment on the intersection of race and gender in your sources? How does racial discourse that you're seeing interact with the formation of specifically male medical authority, especially over female bodies, in opposition to female medical practitioners like midwives?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that it is absolutely, it's a question that answers itself really, because it is part of this dynamic, I think. So I mean, what I'm looking at on the one hand is the elevation of a very particular kind of knowledge, and it's a knowledge which we still we still sort of reify today at the top of this hierarchy. When we think about objectivity and when we think about clinical experimentation, this is the kind of knowledge we're talking about. And this knowledge is absolutely, in the 17th and 18th century, the provenance of a very particular group of people. I mean, they're a group of people who are a network in that kind of traditional sense of actually knowing each other. So you can sketch the lines of that in really neat kinds of ways. But the question about the relationship of gender goes beyond, I think, the sort of exclusion of female expertise from that realm, which is, which absolutely takes place. I mean, I think the construction of gender feeds into the role of medical authority in different ways. And so perhaps the more interesting informants about that are the kinds of barber surgeons and the kinds of writers who are writing about cultural customs, about ethnography, who are contributing absolutely to the kind of discourses that Jennifer Morgan has sketched. These are the people who are writing about women specifically, not just excluding them, but actually writing about them. And so it's the connection between that kind of knowledge, which is generated through the process of encounter, and how it feeds into, or how it is forgotten, how the sources of that are kind of suppressed, I think, and how it's naturalized by the suppression of those sources, which I think is really key. And when I think about, I spent a long time trying to think about, how these discourses feed into the kinds of things that, that so many people who have written, particularly in the context of England, have sort of sketched out. And I always go back to the role of John Bulwer, who, whose work covers Kim Hall's book, right, who is himself a medical practitioner. So these people are absolutely contributing to the kind of broader cultural debate about morals and morality, about virtue, about women, about social class, and all of these are happening in this particular complex. So I suppose the challenge is to recover the dynamic of that in its kind of complete form, and also the disappearance of that dynamic. Thanks.
Pablo?
This is not an answer, but I just wanted to signal the work of Hannah Barker, who is asking the question, whose work has been so important, at least for me, in thinking about those technologies, right, like, that ended up being so important, right, like, for the history of the transatlantic slave trade, that Mediterranean world that also Herman is conversant with, that space of interaction of the 15th century becomes so important in thinking about what happened afterwards. So again, thinking with pre-modern conceptualizations of bodies is crucial. I just wanted to say hi and to signal the importance of that work.
Excellent. And it looks like we only have time for one more question. So I'm going to go with Patricia Marcos's question. I was wondering if you have thoughts on the idea of producing universal models about what race is, namely that race emerged with science and secularism and quote unquote exists and is executed in the world in a very prescriptive manner. How would you frame early modern racial formations and their confessional nature, even when they are written by physicians? What potential does early modern world hold in showing the pliability and plasticity of race as a political project that deploys nature to achieve its specific ends? And if you want me to repeat any part of the question, I'm happy to do so.
I mean, I don't want to hog the conversation, and I feel like Pablo, I mean, everybody here has something they could say about this. I just want to say it's a really beautiful question, and I think it sketches the parameters of what it is that we're talking about here in such an important way, because it is in some senses a question about the specificity of early modern concepts of race and what the risk that we run in essentializing those concepts as well and reproducing them as something which exists outside of the early modern period. So I sort of take it as a really important rejoinder, I think, if nothing else. But I see Pablo wants to intervene and he knows more about it.
But Cécile has her hand up, and she had her hand up before, so please.
Yeah, I have a very short comment on this topic, which is thinking about, how rich the messiness of the early modern period is for answering these kinds of questions. And it's exactly because, there is no way to answer it in any, uniform manner for that period, that it is so enlightening, although not from that period, right? So enlightening about what, would ravel and would become kind of the threads of the world in which we live.
So, hi, Patricia. This is a great question. And I only have a minute, so I'm not gonna say, I don't have time to say all the things that I want to say about it. What I would say is that you are pointing out to something that is crucial here. It is the differences in between claims that are essentialists about nature, about the nature of human beings. This is claims about race as saying something that makes claims about how either people from East Asia or people from Africa are different from Europeans, and the nature of the claims that the science itself and secular science provide. And this is because, by and large, secular science do not make essentialist claims, right? Like, it is not interested in the why. And that is why it has been used and perpetuated in a way that provides a sort of empirically grounded nature for what in reality are not logically. They have never been logical. As a matter of fact, if you look at the history of early modern European thought, very few people actually seriously think it make any essentialist claims because they were contradictory. And this is something that Herman was also providing us with at the beginning, right? Like, it is so contrary to everything that is kind of on the basis of early modern and late medieval European thought, as is to make it very hard to make essentialist claims. And science itself does not provide the answer, right? Like, but it does provide, as you said, race as a pliable, illogical, plastic concept that it perpetuates and is deployed again in the order or with the intentionality of perpetuating certain kind of political, social, and economic projects with the supposed ascription of science, right? Like, but science, again, not as an essential or essentialist project itself. So you're getting at the core of the both the issue, the messiness, and the possibilities, and the richness, and the necessity for, as I was saying before, for the theorization, for the organization of these categories in this pre-modern era. We are by no means done with the kind of study that we need to do and the space that we need to establish and think with. So.
Okay, in the interest of time, because we all know it's very precious and you all have a lot of work to do, or you have to go to sleep as it is late. Thank you all. Apologies for those of you whose questions we did not get to answer, but hopefully this conversation will continue in many different formats. Thank you all again for coming to listen to these wonderful scholars, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.